Hi friends, Erin from the Impatient Gardener here, standing next to this beautiful Linda's baby dahlia here at the end of the season. And you might be wondering what you should be doing with your dahlias here at the end of the growing season. Now, I do have a comprehensive 2-video series on this, but it's a lot to take in and there's a lot of detail in there. So what I'm going to try to do in this video is pare this down to just the basics to kind of get you through. And if you want to dig into it a little deeper, I'll put links to those in the description. So the thing I think you should start with here is that if you are a little confused because you've heard of all these different methods of managing dahlias at the end of the season, you should take comfort in that, because what that means is there are a lot of different ways to do this. There isn't just one way to manage what you should do with your dahlias at the end of the season. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the different things you can do, and then I'm going to tell you what I do. So first off, do you need to dig your dahlias? The answer is maybe, maybe not. If you live in zone 8 or above, you do not need to dig your dahlias. They'll be fine overwintering in the ground. If you live in zone 7, they might be fine in the ground, depending on the winter you have. If you live in zone 6 or below, unless you have a really crazy winter, you will probably lose them. There is nothing wrong with growing a dahlia as an annual. So if you don't feel like digging them, don't worry about it. You'll just have an annual. You'll have to buy more next year. It's no problem. So when do you dig your dahlias? One school of thought is that you let all the foliage get killed back by frost, turn black, and then you think about digging. Another school of thought is that you can actually, at the end of the season, cut off the stems to force them into dormancy, because you want your tubers to be dormant when you dig them or close to it. Now this little guy, this is what I've done here. I covered it up with foil because there are hollow stems and I didn't want water to get in there. Now I'm going to tell you, I don't know if that's necessary, because I can't imagine there's any flower grower who's cutting off thousands of dahlias and then covering up the stems with foil, but I didn't want to take any chances. I cut this back about a week ago, and that's about how long you should wait. Whether they get killed back by frost or you're going to force them into early dormancy by cutting off the stems at about 4 inches tall, you want to wait about a week so that those tubers can get as much of that energy as they possibly can, and then they go dormant, and then you get ready to dig them. I like to use a fork for digging them up because a shovel can cut through them really easily, and you don't need to bring up all that soil with it. This way you'll sift through some of that soil and you'll just get the tubers out. Start a decent distance away from the top so that you are trying to avoid spearing any tubers here, and just gently work your way around. Odds are it'll be pretty easy to pull them up. Okay, and that's what we're pulling out, is this mass of tubers. Now let's talk about what we do next. So here's where we get to the sort of choose your own adventure portion of dahlia storage. So if you're growing your dahlias in containers, say a small container, and you want to bring that whole container into your storage area, you can do that. Leave them right in that container. If you're like me and you've dug them out, you've got a couple of options here. One is you can just put these into a cool, dark place to just dry off all this soil on here and come back to this in a couple of days and knock that soil off. Or you can do what I do, which is rinse these off and clean these tubers off so that you can see what you're working with here. So whether you've rinsed off your dahlias or you're letting the soil dry on them, the next step is the same for any method. And it's crucial. Label your dahlias. They all look exactly the same once they're out of the ground and not blooming, so you need to label them. I like to use these type of plastic labels that just sort of slide on there. Figure out some method that you can actually attach to the tubers, or alternately, you can actually write on the tubers, but you can't do that until they're past that drying step. So that's why I like to label them at this point. Okay, now that they're labeled, now they get a chance to rest. You want to put these in a cool and dark place, like a basement or a cool garage, something like that, and dry. And you want them to dry down. How long that takes depends a lot on how much humidity you have. For me, it's typically about 3 days. In some places, it might only be a day or it might be a week. You got to feel it out for yourself. What you don't want them to do is dry down to the point where they've started shriveling, and you want them to be nice and firm. Okay, so enough time has passed and you've done the drying portion of this. If you left the soil on, brush the soil off as much as you can. You don't need to store that soil. Brush that off. Now you have another option. You can divide now, or you can divide in spring. Now, a lot of times when you buy a dahlia, you might get a single tuber. You do not have to divide your dahlias down to single tubers, and I never do. I prefer to leave them in clumps because I want bigger plants and more flowers. Generally, when you're buying a dahlia tuber and you just get a single tuber, that's because the place you're buying it from is sending them out for propagation. So the point is that they can maximize how many tubers they're sending out if they can get it down to one good tuber, which is fine. You'll get a great plant, you'll get flowering. It's just that as you're starting to store your own tubers, you might consider keeping them as clumps. So there's two advantages to dividing your tubers in fall. One is that you can see the eyes much better. So the eyes are these little bumps that are on the neck of the tubers. Every tuber has to have an eye. That's where the sprouts will come from. If you don't have an eye, you won't have a plant. The other thing is that the tubers tend to be softer now, so it's easier to actually do the actual physical dividing. So the advantages to dividing your tubers in spring are that one, it's one less thing you need to do now in fall, and two, you're going to be able to take a close look at how everything's stored, and you're going to be able to spend your time dividing the ones that have stored well, because not everything will. It's a rarity that you would have a year in which every single tuber comes through, even if everything is going right. There are often some losses. So you're not wasting your time on dividing tubers that you wouldn't have to otherwise. I prefer to divide my tubers in spring, and I divide them at the time that I pot them up ahead of time because I've done lots of videos on this. I like to start my tubers ahead in pots in mid-April. So that's when I pull them out of storage. I take a look at them, I divide them and pot them up all on the same day, get it all done in one fell swoop. Regardless of whether I'm dividing my tubers in spring or fall, I cut off these little stringy bits. There's no need, you don't need those on there. It just adds mess, so you can take those off. Now that we've got them all cleaned up, what you want to be looking for is the eye. The eye will actually not be on the tuber itself, it'll be on the neck. And you can see, they're very easy to see here in fall. You can see there are several eyes right here. Here's another one right here. It's just a little raised white, almost like a little white dot, little nodule that sticks up. That's an eye, and you need to have one of those at least per tuber in order for it to grow. Now when I divide, I like to just start by trying to divide by hand and see how things go, and I can tell already this one's just going to fall apart. In fact, that's a perfect division as far as I'm concerned right there. And I think this other one is going to fall apart. So this ended up being a single tuber division, but you can see it's got plenty of eyes. It'll just be fine. And you can actually cut your stem a little shorter on this as well. Now you've got a perfect little dahlia tuber. Let's say you wanted more of this. Now I would leave this clump the way it is, but let's say you wanted more of these. The first thing I would do is this tuber right here is looking bad. It's got a crack in it. It looks kind of old and gnarly. I'm just going to cut that out. We don't need that tuber. Now what you want to do is look for eyes, and then you can divide, even cutting like right up the stem if need be. So you need at least one tuber and one eye per division. And you can actually just, it's easier by the way with a sharp pair of scissors than it is with a pruner, but this works too. Use what you got. Now you've got a nice eye, two tubers, lots of eyes, good bunch of tubers, ready for storage. Now you've got your dahlias either divided or not divided, depending on how you're going to store them, and we get into the storage thing. And there are so many different ways to do this, but it all comes down to two factors, humidity and temperature. For temperature, you're looking at storing these in a frost-free place that is roughly, ideally, somewhere between 45 and 50 or 55 at the top end degrees. That's sort of your window. You don't want them to freeze. You don't want them in a refrigerator. As for humidity, I can't give you a humidity range, but dahlia tubers will rot during storage if they are too wet, and they will desiccate if they are too dry. So whatever method you're going to store them in, you are going to need to check on them about once a month. I usually start in January checking on them once a month. So there's so many different ways to store a dahlia and what you can store them in. it's good to store them in something because you're trying to help control that humidity. So some people use vermiculite, some people use peat moss. Klaus Dobby wraps his in sheets of newspaper. Some people just use old potting soil and just sort of bury them in a box in the potting soil. I have landed onto wood shaving pet beddings as my storage method of choice. It has worked very well for me, whereas some of these other methods haven't. It's also really inexpensive to buy a big bale of that at a pet store or a feed store. Depending on what you're storing them in, you might actually have to even moisten that a little bit. I will moisten my pet bedding just a touch, just to get a little bit of moisture in there. And I would certainly think about doing that with something like peat moss if it wasn't a brand new bag. So you want to nestle your tubers that have been labeled into whatever sort of mix they're going to be in a box of some sort. I prefer to use plastic crates that have some breathing in them, but some dahlia growers will actually store them in plastic, in contained Rubbermaid containers. So again, don't stress too much. You might have to try out a bunch of different options before you find the right thing for you, but you can find an example of somebody storing dahlias in probably 100 different ways, and so there is a way for you out there too. So I nestle my dahlias in crates, and then I actually stick a large plastic contractor size garbage bag around them and just pull it up. I don't seal it, but I find that that helps me with my humidity. And again, this is going to depend entirely on how you store your dahlias and what the conditions are where you're storing yours. I will tell you right now, I store mine in a very cold corner of the basement. It's actually where our well pump is. It's significantly cooler than the rest of the basement, but it is not always very cool. So it can get a little on the warm side in there, and it still works out fine for me. Now that you've got your dahlia tubers all nestled away for winter, just remember to check on them every so often. I keep a spray bottle of water near mine so I can just kind of spritz the medium that they're in if I feel like it's getting too dry. Pull them out, dig around in there, pull one out, check on it, feel it. If it's feeling firm and it hasn't started like really shriveling up or something, you're on the right track. Everything's going well. If you feel like there's a little bit of give to it, or it's starting to look a little dry and shrivelly, then you might want to add some moisture to your medium. Okay, so that's the rundown of what you should be doing with your dahlias this fall. I've got lots of other videos on digging dahlias, storing dahlias, planting dahlias, dividing dahlias, you name it. I'll put a list of them in the description below so you can check those out if you're interested. But just know this, there are ways to get this done. Don't overthink it. Don't stress about it, because even the best dahlia growers in the world, the professionals, are storing them in very different ways. So don't stress about it. There's a lot of ways to reach the end goal of having your dahlias come out of storage in spring doing great. Thank you for watching. Have a great day in your garden. Enjoy those dahlias.